Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to this next instalment of God has spoken by his prophets. So we'll start with a prayer and then we'll crack right on. Our most kind of righteous Father in heaven, we thank you for having been with us so far in this series, having been with us so far today. I ask that you will bless the discussion we have today as we're looking at this next part of prophecy as revealed in Scripture, that you will bless each one of us and that we may be able to learn more about your guiding hand throughout history, and that there is still something to look forward to. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, now you'll remember from the previous one, so we're on our fifth. Yes, I can count. On our fifth talk on this. So today we're looking at when seals are opened and trumpets blown. So we've just looked through the history of Christendom. We've looked at the way that Christianity stopped being what it should have been and started being something else. And then God's turning point, we've looked at kind of the end of the Reformation, about the end of papal power, the civil power that the Roman Church had. And then also looking at the prophecy of the 2,300 days and 1844 and all of the things that happened around that time, and how so there's an awful lot of history in just that short few years. And today we get to look at a little bit more of that history as well as some other lines of history throughout the last couple of thousand years. A couple of very interesting parts of all 7 of these topics. I think by far this is the most difficult one. The other ones, most of what I've shown you so far has been quite easy. From my point of view, from somebody who's grown up in the Adventist church, who's heard these prophecies many times before, some of it's quite easy. So I mean, things like Daniel 2 and the statue we looked at there, or even Daniel 7 with the beasts, quite simple. Even the 2,300 days, even though I mentioned the historicist point of view, a lot of people agree with the historicist point of view, and a lot of the earlier parts of the sessions we've talked about, those were all things that are quite widely accepted by historicists, were accepted by people like Luther, by people like Newton. They accepted these same things. Only really last week when we started looking at 1844, that was probably the first thing that's more specifically Adventist, and more specifically the part of Adventist historicism. Today we're going to look more, I think, looking at the 7 seals, kind of a little bit, that is fairly specifically Adventist, and the 7 trumpets, we're going to get stuck a little bit with those, so you'll see why, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute. I can see Paul nodding his head already, as he is well aware of the issues that there are with this. So the first bit we get to look at now, society at large is aware of the idea that there are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. There is this idea, and it pops up every so often in popular culture. There have been the last couple of years, there have been a couple of films called The 4 Horsemen. Nothing specifically related to the 4 horsemen themselves, but it's talking about a group of magicians who call themselves the 4 horsemen. And it's all kind of cultural references to this part of prophecy, this part of Revelation, and what it was that was revealed to John as he was there on the Isle of Patmos. So the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, society looks at those and they're expecting literally 4 guys on horses to come riding out at some point and something to happen. That they believe that's what the Bible seems to teach. That's a futurist point of view. I think we mentioned the groups, and that's definitely a futurist interpretation. If you look at the historicist interpretation, which is the one we've been looking at, the answer is actually no, we're not waiting for the 4 horsemen. They've already happened a long time ago. So we're going to look at those which form part of the 7 seals. That's our first piece of business today. So you remember a couple of weeks ago we looked at the 7 churches. So it's Revelation chapter 2 and Revelation chapter 3. Looking through those, and we came up with a table that looks like this. Now this is, say in the Adventist church, this one is quite widely accepted. This is there's very little argument on this. Maybe a few dates shifted left and right a little bit. Some people kind of argue over the decades, but in general terms, everyone agrees with this interpretation. We're going to look at some bits which are a bit less clear, a bit less easily done. So the first bit, after you go through Revelation chapter 3, you then hop over. The next part of the vision is Revelation chapter 4. It's a completely different section. We have, say up on the screen there, verses 2 and 3. So immediately I was in the Spirit, and before me was a throne in heaven, and someone was sitting on it. The one who sat on the throne looked like, or who had the appearance of jasper and carnelian. A rainbow resembling an emerald encircled the throne. I always remember once when I was living down in Swindon, which is quite close to where the Adventist College is down south, Newbold College, we would regularly get students who were people who were studying to become pastors would come, and they would help us. They would serve placements, and it's all kind of part of their studies to have some practical experience. So we would get a regular stream of students would come in, and there was one guy particularly he was recently ordained pastor, Isaac Liebert, serves in the North England Conference. We had him for a while, and he's one of those guys. He's incredibly enthusiastic about things, and I can remember him when he was studying Greek, and he was studying it particularly in terms of Revelation, and he found it was really interesting because John, of all of the writers in the New Testament, John's Greek is the worst. John has the simplest Greek. Compared to Paul, who has this kind of PhD level Greek, he's very flowery in his speech. He was saying that John has the simplest speech. It's the speech of an adolescent, maybe, is kind of the level of Greek that John had. And one of the difficulties that John has is trying to describe what he's seeing. And it's a rainbow, but it's emerald encircling the throne. What does an emerald rainbow look like? Because a rainbow, by default, is kind of multiple colors. And you get things like it's glass, but it's sea, but it's fire, and things like that. And you see John struggling to describe the scenes that are before him. How can somebody who has sat there have the look of jasper and carnelian, precious stones? How is that? It doesn't make sense. This is John struggling to try to put into Greek what it was that he's seen before him. What he is seeing is impressive. In my Bible, this whole chapter is entitled John Sees Heaven. After going through the 7 churches, he's then taken up to heaven, and he's shown the heavenly throne room. He sees God the Father, he sees Jesus, he sees the 24 elders around the throne, he sees the 4 animals, which it's an odd thing to see, with these, one the head of an ox, one the head of a man, and things like that. It seems a bit strange. And then you come into chapter 5, and then a scroll was handed to the one who was sitting on the throne. You'll see there, and the scroll is closed with 7 seals. And so it's who is worthy to open these 7 seals? And nobody steps forward. Now, John, of course, very upset by this. He comes down and it says, verse 3, "But there was no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth who could open the scroll or look inside it. I cried bitterly because there was no one who was worthy to open the scroll or look inside." And then verse 5, "But one of the elders said to me, 'Do not cry. The Lion from the tribe of Judah, David's descendant, has won the victory so that he is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals.'" So there is somebody who is able to open the scrolls. This is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the son of David. And verse 6, "Then I saw a lamb standing in the center of the throne in the midst of the living creatures and the elders. The lamb looked as if it had been slain." This is a symbology and description of Jesus, the one who is our salvation. So here, before anything else happens, we get this picture of Jesus, and that he is the only one who is able to open the scroll and explain and show and see what's happening. So then we start on, and he begins to open. There's a song that those who are present are singing as, "You are worthy to take the scroll, to open its seals, because you were killed, and the blood of your death you brought people, and with the blood of your death you brought people for God from every tribe, language, people, and nation." So you have this whole scene that's happening up in heaven, and then chapter 6 is where we get to actually opening the seals. Now, you can go through very similar as we've done with the others, and you have 7 seals. The number 7, I mentioned before, comes up a lot. There is a lot of symbology behind the number 7, a kind of a complete number, where everything is, that's, the whole is a 7, so we have 7 days in the week comes, it's kind of that same symbology following through. And here we have another repetition of 7, so we had 7 churches, now we have 7 seals. And we'll see that there's also 7 trumpets, which we'll look at today, and there are 7 last plagues, which we might look at in a couple of weeks if we get time. These are kind of repetitions that are going through. We've mentioned this idea that Revelation and Daniel as well repeat themselves and they bring out new information. So here we're going to see a repetition of what we've already seen with the 7 churches, but we're also going to see new information. Now, seals 1 to 5 are quite light on information. There's not much detail in there. There's not a huge amount of information. But then when we get to number 6, there's a lot more. The seal itself is a lot longer, and then there's kind of a parenthesis inside there as well, which we'll see in a minute when we get to it. So we can go through, have a look through these 7 seals. So those are the verses, so you can follow along. So chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. Then I watched the Lamb open the first of the 7 seals. I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come." So I looked, and there before me was a white horse. The rider of the horse held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out, determined to win victory, or conquering it in order to conquer. So this is a white horse, a conqueror on its back with a bow, a crown, which we think of as victory, particularly in Roman times. Whoever wore a crown, that was a sign of victory. So that's the first one. Then the second one, and I saw another horse came out, red. It was given power to take away peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. And was given a big sword. So here we see blood and persecution and death and fighting coming out. Then the third seal, and there before me was a black horse, and its rider held a pair of scales in its hands. This is a quart of wheat for a day's pay, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay, and do not damage the olive oil and the wine. We've seen olive oil already when we were looking at the 2 witnesses and talking about the lamps that were in the temple. We talk of the oil as being the Holy Spirit. So we cannot damage the Holy Spirit. We cannot damage the wine, which just last Sabbath we were here taking the wine as communion, as representative of the blood of Christ. These kind of central truths we can't hurt during whatever it is that's happening here. And in the 4th seal, I looked before, and there was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death and Hades, who was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill people by war, by starvation, by disease, and by the wild animals of the earth. So again, a very dark death. This is kind of where we get the idea of the character of death, the man who shows up with his sickle to hurry you along the way towards the whatever is to come, this kind of cultural reference that you have. And then the 5th seal, the souls who have been killed because they were faithful to the word of God and to the message they had received. And what were these souls doing? They were crying out in a loud voice, "Holy and true Master, how long until you judge the people of the earth and punish them for killing us? How long until you avenge our blood?" And it says, then each of them was given a white robe and was told to wait a little while longer. There were still some of their fellow servants and brothers and sisters in the service of Christ who must be killed as they were. They had to wait until all was finished and complete. And then the 6th seal, and then, as I mentioned, there's a lot more in the 6th seal. So we open the 6th seal, was a great earthquake. The sun was black, and the moon became like blood. Stars fell from the sky like figs falling from a fig tree when the wind blows. The sky disappeared, and every mountain and island was moved from its place. And the kings of the earth, the rulers, the generals, the rich people, the powerful people, the slaves and the free people, which is everybody, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks on the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us, hide us from the face of the one who sits on the throne and from the anger of the Lamb. The great day for their anger has come, and who can stand against it?" So this seems to be, it's certainly ending in judgment. There's a terror of what they can see coming. And then the seventh seal, chapter 8, verse 1, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And that's the seventh seal. Now, we skipped out the entire of chapter 7 there. There's kind of a parenthesis in the middle of number 6. I think we'll come to that one in a second, but we can look at, in general terms, so we saw a white horse, then we saw a red horse, then a black horse, and then this pale horse that looked like death. We have these martyrs of some kind, and then we have a lot of signs. So the earthquake, the sky turning black, and the heavens being opened as a scroll, these kind of things. And then the seventh seal is just half an hour of silence, whatever it is we want to interpret that. So what I would recommend is the interpretation, and this one is quite widely accepted within the Adventist Church. I keep putting that qualification because of what's coming next. The white horse, very similar to how we looked when we were looking at the churches, with the Church of Ephesus that we started with, this time of victory in the gospel where they were going forward, they were converting people, there was a lot of good happening. And then followed by a time of persecution. We mentioned about the persecutions under Nero and people like him, where they were really going after the church, going after Christians and killing them as much as they possibly could. And then, much as we just saw with the 7 letters of the 7 churches, errors started to creep into the church. Things which before were definitely firm started to change, and as we brought compromise into the church. And then things went wrong for a while, and you end up with a dead church, the horse with death on his back. This is essentially what we can understand from that. And then the martyrs, those who were killed as part of the Reformation, because there were so many of them killed who stood up for what they believed. Kind of before the Reformation and then into the Reformation, so many people lost their lives. So far, this quite well maps with the letters to the 7 churches. But when we've mentioned and we've talked about recapitulation, this idea of repetition within prophecy, there's more information. So the last 2, they don't line up in the same way, but there's more information, there's more stuff that we can gather. So what can we understand from the 6th and the 7th seals? So the 6th seal, we start off with an earthquake. Now, the traditional Adventist view of this, there were several events that happened within a relatively short period of time. So 1755 was a huge earthquake in Lisbon. This was before they were able to measure it, but estimates are kind of 8.8, 9, that kind of level of earthquake. So a really big earthquake. And this was certainly extremely devastating. There've been bigger earthquakes, but ones that have done such massive damage in such a short space of time, there haven't been many of those. And particularly when you're talking about areas of interest to the Christian world, because remember, we're looking at this, we've been following through the Christians, so we're following through the Reformation, and then here we are still in Europe, and this is definitely the worst one that ever happened in Europe. So 1755, 1st of November, it was a holy day, and being a Catholic country, that meant that almost everybody was in the churches, were in the convents, were in places like that. And these big buildings, they just fell on top of people and killed whole congregations in an instant. At the time, there were about 150,000 people living in Lisbon, and depending on which reports you read, anywhere between 20 and 90,000 people died during that, because of that earthquake. So there was a lot of them died within the earthquake, and then there were huge fires that ravaged the city afterwards, and more people died in those. And it was felt around the world. So in Morocco, there was a village of somewhere between 8 and 10,000 people, which just disappeared. The ground swallowed up, and there was no trace of it left. The ground opened up, swallowed them. In Loch Lomond up here, there was a 28-inch swell. They saw the loch come up for no apparent reason. It was only kind of when the post arrived long enough later, they were able to work out that it was because of an earthquake that happened so far away. And tremors were felt as far away as the Caribbean, so Antigua and Barbados were able to feel the tremors of this earthquake. This was a huge event, had a massive impact on European culture, In many ways, you read the Wikipedia article on the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. It has a huge section talking about the impact on culture and how it changed the way people were thinking in those times. It was a massive event. And in fact, Sir Charles Lyell, who was, I understand he was a witness of this, he said, "A sound of thunder was heard underground, and immediately afterward a violent shock threw down the greater part of that city. In the course of about 6 minutes, 60,000 persons perished. The sea first retired and laid the bar dry. It then rolled in, rising 50 feet above its original level." This is a terrific catastrophe that happened. And we start off here, we're looking kind of about the time, so the previous seal, we're looking at the Reformation, this kind of era. And so this fits in suddenly kind of the end of this era, just before General Berthier goes into the Vatican and dethrones the Pope. Here we have this happening in Europe. And then from there were two signs. We start to see a shift here. Something I've mentioned a few times with June, the way that things change. So here we see a shift from Europe. Things start moving towards the US. We're going to look at this in a lot more detail next week when we talk about the rise of the United States and how that's looked at in prophecy. But in 19th of May 1780, the day just suddenly became dark. So by midday, they were going to use candles. Farmers were unable to work. They just went home. There was no way, even outside, they couldn't do anything just because it was so dark. I mean, historians today they're trying to work out if it was a forest fire mixed with fog or whatever it was that caused this over much of New England, which, remember, that's where everyone in the US lived in those days. This was still the war. The American War of Independence was still happening at this time. So everyone was still in kind of like the northeastern part of the US. That was where the vast majority of the population was. And they saw this. Suddenly everything just went dark, a very unnatural darkness. And then by that night, when things started to clear up, when the moon did show itself, it was blood red. I mean, we had a red moon here not that long ago, but it was much, much more than that. It was blood red, really, really strong. People thought it was the end of the world. There was kind of panic in the streets, as I'm sure you can imagine, because it wasn't an eclipse. The full moon had been just the day before, which means it was impossible to have been an eclipse. The moon was on the wrong side of the earth. So they weren't able to explain away and just say, "Oh no, it's fine. This is easy." People thought that the Lord had come and judgment was any minute. There was a Mr. Tenney who lived in Exeter in New Hampshire. He said the darkness of the following evening was probably as gross as has ever been observed since the Almighty Fiat gave birth to life. A sheet of white paper held within a few inches of the eyes was equally invisible with the blackest of velvet. Because we think velvet is one of the things that most absorbs light. To have a piece of white paper in front of your face and not be able to see it, that's darkness. And this was massively recorded across so many places in that place. In fact, there was John Greenleaf Whittier, who was a poet. He wrote a poem, and part of this poem, "Men prayed and women wept, all ears grew sharp, to hear the doom blast of the trumpet shatter, the black sky that the dreadful face of Christ might look from the rent clouds, not as he looked a loving guest at Bethany, but stern as justice and inexorable law." They thought judgment was here. They were expecting Jesus to come down. It's like, right, who's been naughty and who's been nice? This was what they were expecting to happen on this very dark day. And then just a few years later again, I mean, the Leonid meteors, this happens on a regular basis. They come down. A couple of years ago, there was quite a big showing. I seem to remember there was terrible clouds, so we saw almost nothing up here. But it's something that happens. I mean, obviously you're familiar with them. 1833 was one year where it was particularly strong. There have been other years that were similar, but that year it was completely clear skies. Everybody saw it. Other years where it's been particularly bad, there's a beautiful wood carving of that somebody did it was a sailor, so he was in the middle of the ocean, and there were no clouds there, and he saw this Leonid shower. But this was the one that was it was visible, people could see it. And it was seen all over the US. Somebody in Boston tried to count, and they reckoned no less than 240,000 meteors that fell in that time. That's an awful lot of shooting stars. And the description that we have, here's stars in the sky fell to the earth like figs falling from a fig tree when the wind blows. They were just falling over the place. And in fact, this was a wood carving, a wood block carving of the time. I mean, I've seen kind of one or two shooting stars. I remember when the last time the Leonids came round, I wanted to see them, but it was cloudy that night. I think if you woke up at like 3 o'clock in the morning, you could have seen it, but for the rest of us, it wasn't seeable. But this time, everybody saw it, and you're able to go outside and see just the sky falling apart above you. So that kind of these four things happening within such a short space of time, I think is at the right point in the prophecy. So just as we're coming towards the end of the Reformation, the end of persecution that was at the end there, they're coming towards this time. And I know this is something that is still debated today as to whether that's the only interpretation, whether these things will happen again in the future, whether we'll see these together with the rest of the signs here, because after that there's more, because it says then the sky disappeared as a scroll when it was rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved from its place. That part, at least literally, we haven't seen that yet. So whether it was just these three and then a gap to these last bits or not, that's up to discussion with the academics. I'm quite happy to accept that these were at least a warning shot, if not the real thing, on this part of the prophecy. So we end up, by the end of this prophecy, talking about, you get to the end and we're looking at judgment. It is interesting to note the timing and the geography. So as I say, the timing, it fits in right. So the end of the fifth seal, then these things happen. It fits in nicely with the timeline. And then the geography of it, we'll see it repeated next week. Particularly, we'll see this movement of interest. So we've followed through the Christian church throughout through its journey. So you remember when we were looking at the Daniel 2 and at Daniel chapter 7, we started off in the Middle East, and we kind of moved across into Europe. And here we see moving from Europe and moving across to America, because that's where a lot of the interest from the latter parts of prophecy at least start, even if they're not kind of strictly just limited there. So we'll look at those in a lot more detail next week. There's a lot of interesting things that we can pull out next week. But we see this move from Europe to the United States. And then following this, we have these items relating very much to the end, and then we have something that's sealing of the 144,000 on earth. So we have this period where people are sealed, they're set aside, they're given a mark so that they're known as gods, and that nobody can mess with them anymore. In fact, at the end of chapter 7, those people will never be hungry again, they will never thirst again, the sun will not hurt them, and no heat will burn them, because the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of water that give life, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. The 144,000, in general terms, we understand as being those who are saved at the very end, those who are still alive when Jesus comes back. And 144,000, I mean, it sounds like a nice number, 12 times 12,000. And in fact, you look at the verses here, it's from the tribe of Judah, 12,000. From the tribe of Reuben, 12,000. You go through 12 tribes that are listed here. Again, the number 12 is used so many times throughout the Bible. We had the 12 tribes of Israel, and you had the 12 disciples, this large group, this encapsulating group. Within the 12 tribes, that's kind of envisaged, that's not the whole earth. So us as, even though we're not necessarily blood children of Abraham, we are spiritual children of Abraham, and so we're able to say that we are part of those tribes. by some coincidence, it may end up being that the only ones who are left alive adds up to exactly 144,000 at the end. I wouldn't like to speculate at all on that, whether persecution gets that bad that only 144,000 are left. I don't know. As we mentioned on the first of these sessions, looking forward in prophecy is always tricky. We don't want to be in the same position that the Jews were when Jesus came. It's like, no, we know what the Messiah looks like. You're not him. And they missed him because they were so sure of what they thought the prophecy said about what was coming. I think that's one of the things we have to be careful when we're looking at future things. So the 144,000, I'm happy to accept that as a literal number or a figurative number. I just understand it as those who are saved at the end. Because as well as those, there is a great multitude, and I think that is the saved throughout all of the ages. So those who died before the very, very end. So all of that happens within the sixth seal, and in the seventh seal, you have silence for half an hour. So the sixth seal stops just before Jesus arrives. Everyone is trying to hide from the face of Jesus who's just coming. So to me, it seems that this is talking about the very end. This is when Jesus is coming back. Conjecture about what silence in heaven means. Heaven is silent because everyone's on their way here, or everyone is here because we'll look in a couple of weeks' time about Jesus' second coming, and he'll arrive on a cloud, but it's not a cloud; it's a cloud of angels. And we have that same idea in the Nativity story, which I'm sure we'll hear about 100 times over the next month or so, of this cloud of angels who are there praising and giving glory that Jesus has been born, that Emmanuel has been born on earth. This idea of that happening, for me, I think that's enough to empty heaven. And Jesus doesn't need to leave behind somebody to watch the dog or anything like that. It's everyone can come and enjoy the celebration that there is for Jesus coming again and putting an end to the terrible state that this world is in, because everyone has an interest in this. So, personally, I believe that silence in heaven, that is Jesus and everybody are here. And that's why heaven's silent. So that's the seven seals. So that gets us through here, looking through initial triumph of the gospel, then persecution because of the gospel. Then error starts to creep in. You end up with a dead church for so long, but in the church there's reformation. Truth comes back into the church over this period, and then the last period, there are troublous times, there's tumultuous times, there's a lot of things happening, and not all of them are nice. We get that idea, and then at the very end we have the second coming. Now you look at that where we sit, we're in the sixth seal. We are in this period where we're expecting some not nice things to happen. We're expecting difficult times. We're expecting tumultuous times, and I think we can quite happily say that this world definitely fits into that category. Every day we turn on the news and we get exactly the same thing. We see what a state this world is in, and we can see that it's not getting better, much as those of the late 19th century, early 20th century, we had such high hopes of humanity will be able to right itself and become this wonderful creature of its own. And then it was the First World War, and then the Second World War, and then we've killed so many people over this last century and a half since they were there preaching this idea that humanity is able to save itself. I think we're very much waiting for Jesus to come so that Jesus can do the saving, because we're not up to the job. Now, we mentioned 2-3 weeks ago this idea of chiasm, and this is a relatively new theological tool where people have discovered that there are patterns within prophecies. And we looked at that particularly in terms of the seven churches, and how the seven churches, there is a definite pattern around. You have the dead church in the middle, the dark ages in the middle, and then you have a repeating pattern around the sides of that. I mentioned last week I was going to point out that today I'm going to explain there is actually a chiasm to the whole of Revelation. The whole of the book of Revelation has a pattern to it. And this is it. So you start off on the left, you have these three sweep throughs. So we have the seven churches, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago, the seven seals we just looked at, and the seven trumpets, which we're going to look at next. Then in the middle, you have this idea of war in heaven, and there are some interesting themes there. And then you have the seven plagues, and you have Jesus' second coming, and then we have the New Jerusalem. We have this switch. Now, I'm doing the most basic chiasm with only 3 parts in it. It can be broken down. You see ones that have 7. Everybody likes to make things in 7s when you're looking in the Bible, because 7 is the perfect number. But I've seen ones that are like 20 deep, and kind of things that are exact pattern over the course. There are discussions as to which one is the right one, so I'm sticking with the simplest one, which everyone agrees on. So you end up with 7 churches. Those are the kind of the chapter references for how it's split up. So you start off with the 3. If you're a historicist, you agree with this. So the first 3 go through repeated long histories of God's people. So looking at what happens in terms of religious terms, in terms of what's happening in the secular world, what's happening around us. The 7 trumpets particularly, I think we'll start to see other non-Christian things creeping in maybe. Then you have a few central narrative themes in the middle, which is what we're going to be talking about next week. And then the final moments of Earth's history and the beginning of eternity. And that's kind of the after the centerfold of the book of Revelation. Now I'm showing this now because we've looked at the 7 churches and the 7 seals. And the 7 trumpets are difficult. There is a great problem. They're hard to understand. They're hard to be able to put a specific definition on them. And I'll show you why in a minute. So they start off, chapter 8, verse 6. Then the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to blow them, or prepared to sound them. So the 7 angels were given 7 trumpets, and they were asked to sound them off. So if we look through them, in fact, I'll show you the verses so you can follow along. So 7 trumpets, the number 7 popping up again. And these are the verses. So, chapter 8, verse 7. The first angel blew his trumpet, and hail and fire mixed with blood were poured down on the earth. 1/3 of the earth and 1/3 of the trees and all the green grass were burned up. It's not so easy to be able to say that's definitely the triumphant church at the beginning. It sounds more like a judgment. It sounds more like something that we wouldn't want to happen, rather than the rider on the white horse of the church of Ephesus were these things that are good and they're kind of victorious, but this doesn't sound like it. So maybe it's not quite the same as the other ones. And then the second angel, and it says, looks like a big mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and 1/3 of the sea became blood, 1/3 of the living creatures in the sea died, and 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. Again, very, very figurative language. It's not immediately obvious to me what that might mean. A third angel, and a large star burning like a torch fell from the sky. It fell on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of the waters. The name of the star is wormwood, and 1/3 of all the water became bitter. And many people died from drinking the water that was made bitter. And the fourth angel blew his trumpet, and 1/3 of the sun, 1/3 of the moon, and 1/3 of the stars was struck. So 1/3 of them became dark, and 1/3 of the day was without light, and also the night. And then you have this interesting little interlude where he says, an eagle was crying in the middle of heaven, crying, woe, 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 for those who live on the earth, because of the remaining sounds of the trumpets that the other 3 angels are about to blow. So there's something special about these last 3 angels. They are the 3 woes. So the 5th angel, I saw a star fall from heaven to the earth. The star was given the key to the hole that leads to the bottomless pit. We've mentioned the bottomless pit a couple of weeks ago. So then it opened up the hole, and smoke came up from the hole, like smoke from a big furnace. Then the sun and the sky became dark because of the smoke from the hole. And locusts came out of the smoke, and they were given power to sting like scorpions. There's a lot more information in this 5th one than there was in the previous 4. So, as part of these woes, there's a lot more detail here. And we'll come back to more of that detail in a minute. The 6th angel blew his trumpet, and I heard a voice coming from the horns on the golden altar that is before God. It says, free the 4 angels who are tied at the great river, who are bound at the great river Euphrates, and let loose the 4 angels who have been kept ready for this, kept ready for an hour and a day and a month and a year, so they could kill 1/3 of the people on the earth. And I heard how many troops on horses were in their army, 200 million, That's a big army. Even China with his 1,000,000-man army, that's not up to that. So the horse and their riders I saw in a vision like this, they had breastplates that were fiery red, dark blue, and yellow like sulfur. And again, we have a pause. We have chapter 10 and chapter 11. We've looked at chapter 10 and chapter 11, talking about the French Revolution, talking about the witnesses that were put down by the French Revolution, and that we see that the way we see that happening there. And then you only come to the end of chapter 11, we get the seventh angel blew his trumpet. There were loud voices in heaven saying, "The power to rule the world now belongs to our Lord and his Christ, and he will rule forever and ever." So here we have, that one I think is a little bit clearer. That one's Jesus coming back. That one is the heavenly kingdom being set up, like as we saw, we've seen in previous occasions. So, first one, hail and fire. Second one, a sea mountain. Then a falling star. Then something with the sun, moon, and stars. Then the abyss opens, and we have the first woe. We have the angels who are held at the Euphrates in the second woe. And then we have the kingdom of God being set up, and that's the third woe. Interpretations, perhaps? What do we want to try and put on as interpretations for these? Now, these are difficult. With the seven seals, you look at Adventist theologians, generally speaking, they're roughly agreed on those. The seven churches, very much so. The seven seals, quite well in agreement. By the time you get to the seven trumpets, it becomes more difficult. There was the Adventist Church has called the Biblical Research Institute, which is a wing of the General Conference of the Central Church in America. They have this group called the Biblical Research Institute. Essentially, they're the people we ask difficult questions to. So when the church has a difficult question, they ask them to go and do research. And the institute is essentially, they're scholars called from universities across the world. They are the best scholars that we have, and they are asked, what does this mean? And then they go away, they do research. Sometimes it takes years, depending what the question is, and they'll come back and they'll write a kind of a position piece or a doctrinal piece or a book, or depending what the question is to how it comes up. You go to their website, it's full of very, very interesting articles, very academic. Their director used to be a man called Andrew Rodriguez. He's since retired, but he wrote a few years ago an article based on difficult questions. He wrote an article for Ministry Magazine, which is our church's magazine for pastors. And he was looking at this topic, and the question was, do we know what the seven trumpets mean? And his answer was, kind of. So within the article, he goes through some of the difficulties. There's not an awful lot of information as to what these mean. We know where they sit in history. We look at the chiasm and we can say that this is definitely in the historical part of the book of Revelation. So these are not things we're just going to throw towards the end of time and say that this is all still yet to come. This is something where we say it is a kind of long periods of history from around the time of John-ish up to the second coming. So we know it covers that kind of period, but exactly which bit covers which period becomes tricky. Within his article, he gives, there's a big table, and there's 7 different Adventist scholars or groups of scholars, and their different views on what these mean. Now, the one that we can look at first, Uriah Smith. Uriah Smith, he was a very young man when he joined the church in the mid to late 1800s. He was the editor of the Adventist Review for many years. He was kind of one of our first scholars. He was one of the ones who first went to try and be academic about things. Previously, people had been preachers and they would just go and preach things, but he wanted to be more academic, and he wrote a couple of books, Thoughts on Daniel and Thoughts on Revelation, which are these two here. They were the church's first look at prophecy in a kind of a detailed, methodical way. And so he wrote these books, which were extremely popular, and they were the basis of Adventist theology for many years. His view, the first one, Hail and Fire, was the attack on Rome by the Visigoths, particularly under Alaric. So the Visigoths, they came from the frozen north, which is where the hail comes in. and then the attack on Rome was very, very bloody. So that's kind of like he's pulling that symbology to come up with this idea. And then the sea, the attack by the Vandals. So the Vandals was a tribe in North Africa, one of the 10 tribes, one of the 10 divisions of Rome. So it's a North African group, and they would come across on boats. So the sea mountain was thrown into the sea, and the sea became blood. They were pirates, effectively. That was kind of the attacks they would have. So under Genseric, Genseric, and then have a falling star. So this kind of short-lived time. The attack on Rome by Attila the Hun. This is, of course, the man who, he was ferocious, and that's kind of where he gets the symbology of this coming through. Then looking at the sun, moon, and stars falling, he calls this the fall of Western Rome. So this is when Rome completely fell apart. He looks at the abyss, and he describes that as being the rise of Islam. Looking at the Euphrates and the angels at the Euphrates, he looks at that as the Ottoman Empire, particularly from 1449 to 1840. I'll mention why that in a minute. And then the third one, the kingdom, he says the mystery of God is finished. Now, one of the ones I particularly like about this one, there was a Millerite preacher, so before William Miller, while William Miller was preaching about 1844, there was a preacher named Josiah Litch. He, while studying to be a better preacher, to help in the cause, he came across this prophecy, and he found the bit there where it says a week, or was it an hour and a day and a month and a year. And he said, well, we're using the day-year principle all over the place, so if I apply the day-year principle to that, what does it come up to? And he came up with a very specific time period. And he looked at his interpretation of the prophecy. He came to this conclusion on these prophecies as well. He wasn't as verbose as Uriah Smith, which is why I'm using him as the source, but he came to the same conclusion, and that referred to the Ottoman Empire. He discovered this in early 1840. You see the dates, it ended in 1840. He was able to work out when the Ottoman Empire kind of got its power, and he put a specific day, to say the Ottoman Empire will fall on this day. And he came to this date a couple of months before it happened. And then on that day, the leader of the Ottoman Empire showed up at the British Embassy in Turkey and handed over a letter requesting protection, and basically said, we can't look after ourselves, Britain, can you come and help us? And as you can imagine, that was a great help to the Millerite cause. Everyone went, wow, this day-year thing works. And so that's one of the big things, I think, in favour of this was, particularly of this view, or at least that view of the sixth trumpet, definitely. I think that's one of the big traditional parts of that view. So that was a very specific, very interesting part of that. However, Uriah Smith, whilst his work was fantastic for his time, today we have a lot more access to a lot more copies of the Greek texts. We understand Greek a lot better through the masses of archaeology that's been going on. And Adventist theologians don't just look at books like those written by like the likes of Uriah Smith and leave it at that. They're still there researching and discovering and discussing and challenging things. So there are other views. So another view, C. Mervyn Maxwell, a famous Adventist theologian. This is be the kind of second half of the 20th century. He came out with a view on what these mean. It's a bit different to the one that Uriah Smith had. So he starts off judgment on Jerusalem. God's judgment on Jerusalem is the hail and the blood and the fire. So that's kind of AD 70 when Jerusalem was besieged and destroyed in such a bloody way. And then the mountain that was thrown into the sea, he sees that as God's judgment on pagan Rome. And then the falling star is God's judgment against the professed Christian church. So the professed Christian church, because the Christian church wasn't very Christ-like for so long. And then you end up with the darkness of the Middle Ages when the sun, the moon, and the stars, a third of them were taken away. So you end up a period of darkness, which makes quite a bit of sense to say that could be the Dark Ages, where there was very little and then he talks about the rise of Islam also, and then he looks at the Ottoman Empire, but he has different dates. So he goes from 1453 to 1844. He takes different kind of points in the historical chart to come up with his period. But then he still agrees that the seventh trumpet is the second coming of God. You bring in even more recent, and you end up with John Paulian, Larondel, and Ranko Stefanovic, very modern and still active theologians in our church today who are not sure if they're all on the Biblical Research Institute committees. I'd imagine they've probably served on them at some point or another. But they are all very strong theologians. I've looked at Stefanovic's book on Revelation has been one of the books I've been using to help to prepare these this series. They have again a slightly different view. So God's judgment on Jerusalem. So they're agreeing with Maxwell. They see the fall of Rome, the Roman Empire, again agreeing with Maxwell. But then they start to differentiate. So the apostasy of the Christian church as the third one, and then the rise of secular atheism as being the fourth. So the darkness that is being described, rather than being the darkness of Christianity, is the darkness of atheism creeping into the world. And then when the abyss was opened, the first woe is the reign of secular atheism. And then that means that they put the sixth trumpet, they put that a little bit further forward, because the reign of secular atheism is that's now. So we'd still be in the fifth trumpet. And then the sixth trumpet is still to come with the rise of end-time Babylon. And then at least all three of them agree that the mystery of God is finished in the seventh trumpet. In fact, of the 7 different groups that Rodriguez puts into this article, where this big table he shows all of them agree on the last one, but the other 6 are pretty much up for grabs. The first 4, generally you either follow this kind of view or you follow Smith's. They're you end up in 2 groups, but then 5 and 6, it seems everybody has a different view on what 5 and 6 should be. So I think all of that's quite interesting. I think Uriah Smith, when I was looking at this week, I'd always kind of understood Uriah Smith's one, and I mentioned I liked his one. The difficulty I had this week looking at this, I was trying to put dates on this table. So on the other versions of this table for the 7 seals and for the 7 churches, I put dates along the bottom. I didn't want to do this on this one because this one gets complicated. Because Attila attacked Rome the year before Genseric did, which to me puts this whole thing out of order, which I'd never noticed before. So that kind of confused me a little bit. So I was concerned, as you can imagine. So what is my point in showing you the confusion there is on the 7 trumpets? So far, when we've been looking at all of these parts of prophecy, I've been fairly adamant as to what the correct response is. I mean, we've compared and contrasted some historicist views and some preterist views, comparing whether we think it was Alexander the Great or whether we think it was Antiochus Epiphanes, or these other people who the preterists will put forward as being the answer to these prophecies, and particularly the idea that Daniel was written much later than it claims to have been written. But I think it gets complicated here. Now we look at the chiastic structure, and we can say the 7 trumpets definitely fall within the historical part of the book of Revelation. So I am very happy to accept any of those 3 interpretations that I've gone through today. To say which of those 3 it is, I don't know. And I think that was the point of Dr. Rodriguez's article, was saying that pretty much any of them could be as valid as the others. There's no real glaring errors in any of them to be able to say, well, it's obviously not this one. Whichever one you like, I would suggest you hold on to it. But I would suggest that you don't hold on to it with such strong grasp that you ignore other things around it and get angry with people who believe something different to you. And this is one of the interesting parts about our Christian walk, I think, in general. There are things that we can hold on to and say, this is definitely the answer. And there are some things where we can say, you know what, I don't know. I don't think there's any shame in being able to say that. And in fact, there is a certain amount of courage to recognize the fact that we don't have all the answers. We can't come to a firm conclusion on every single thing. We don't have all of the evidence. I don't speak Greek, so for me to come up with a good answer for this, I think learning Greek good enough to be able to understand it, at least as well as those other men I've just named, would be a good start. I would need to read an awful lot more history to be able to come up with my own one, my own interpretation, my own decision. Or I can just accept it's probably one of those three or something like that and move forward and look particularly at number 7, the mystery of God is finished. The second coming, this is what we look forward to. And this understanding that God has his hand in history and he knew the end from the beginning. He knew what was coming. And still he created us, still he loved us from the start, and he came and he died for us so that we could be saved. Next week we're going to be looking at this central section here, these central narrative themes. There are some really interesting parts there. Here we discover what the Adventist Church has always called the great controversy, the big view of things. Because we've been looking at, particularly this first part of Revelation, we've been looking at the last 2,000 years of history and a little bit further forward until Jesus is coming. Even when we were looking at some of the stuff from Daniel, we were looking kind of 1,000 years before, 600 years before Christ, so the last 2,600 years of history. That's a small, and we've only been looking at the Jews and the Christians. We haven't been looking at everyone else. We've mentioned that Islam could be part of what we looked at today. Maybe, depending on which one of those people you follow. What about the rest of the world? What about everything else? And I think that's where we're looking at this idea of the great controversy. And there is this overarching theme, which is what we're going to be looking at, particularly next week. And the last part of these central themes, there are some more beasts to look at. And I think those beasts have a lot of interest for us today. Because we're starting to get into the bits which haven't yet happened. And we can definitely say this hasn't happened yet, or this is starting to happen. And that's what we're going to be looking at next week. And the week after, we get to look at the really happy bits right at the very end, and the wonderful conclusion that we have. So I know today's maybe not quite as satisfying as last week, where we were able to kind of come up with definite dates and definite things happening. But I think this is still an important lesson that we can learn from prophecy, that we need to be humble and accept what we don't know as well as what we do know. It's very easy for us to try and stand up and on whatever subject, whether it is prophecy, whether it is creation science or something like that, and say, no, this is definitely, I can prove it. Can you prove it? Or do you just have a lot of evidence and that's enough for you to base your faith on? And understand that the other person on the other side is in exactly the same position, because they can't prove what they're saying either, for the most part. Even then, there are rare occasions you need to be ready to accept somebody might have a very good proof that you cannot refute, and in which case you should learn to accept things as well. So we need to be open to that understanding. So that is the end of what I have to say today. Does anybody have any questions on this? No, fair enough. Okay, shall we have a prayer, then we'll close for today. Our most kind and righteous Father in heaven, we thank you for what you've revealed to us. We thank you for the things that we can hold on to, the things where we can see your hand working throughout history, your hand guiding, and the knowledge that you have promised to guide us. That while all of these big things are happening throughout history, that you also have promised to be with us as individuals in our own little part of history, in our 70 years here on this earth, or however long we're here, that you have promised to guide us and to protect us, and that you will never leave us. That just we thank you for your continued work in our lives. We thank you that we're able to get to to surrender ourselves to you and the knowledge that you will only ever do what is best for us, and that you love us more than we can possibly imagine. Please be with us now as we leave this place, and bless us until we're able to meet again. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.